Sheriffs, aldermen, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to today's speech by the Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Mark CARLETON-SMITH. I am Alderman William Russell, the 692nd Lord Mayor of the City of London, and I am delighted to welcome you, both in person and virtually, to Mansion House. I should say that the General and I are old friends, so this is a particularly special event for me. We both ended up in jobs that require us to wear uniforms and perform ceremonial functions, though our medals and badges are very different. I'm not sure which of us performs more of their duties dressed in bright red. But I am very much looking forward to your lecture on making military sense of a disrupted world. The City of London's relationship with the Army goes back centuries, to the London-trained bands who saw action in Tudor times and the English Civil War. Some of the oldest Army regiments have their roots in the city, such as the Royal Fusiliers and the Honourable Artillery Company. And the Rifles' city heritage is reflected in their providing the Lord Mayor's Guard of Honour at every Lord Mayor's banquet. The status of a privileged regiment is a distinction which has been conferred on certain military units by the City of London Corporation to mark a particular affinity and association with the square mile. In fact, the City of London developed its own unique privileges in its relationship with the armed forces. It was one of the only places in the country where men could not be impressed into the Royal Navy, partly thanks to the efforts of Lord Mayor John Wilkes. It is also one of the few places which has the right to challenge Crown troops who wish to pass through, a role performed by the City Marshal, though I'm pleased to say that this now involves welcoming and escorting those troops. At the outbreak of the First World War, my ancestor and predecessor as Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Vansittart Bowater, helped create the London Stock Exchange Battalion of Royal Fusiliers and became its honorary colonel. 1,600 city workers from all walks of life joined what became known as the Stockbrokers Battalion and fought at the Somme and Ypres, with over a quarter of them never coming home. The city maintains many connections with regular, reserve and cadet units based in neighbouring London boroughs. And the City of London Corporation is a gold-level member of the Defence Employer Recognition Scheme. Former Lord Mayor Dame Fiona Woolf signed the Armed Forces Covenant on behalf of the City Corporation in November 2013. It was in recognition of the deep and enduring association, past, present and future, between the City of London and Her Majesty's Armed Forces. As Lord Mayor, I am honoured to be President of the City of London Reserve Forces and Cadets Association. I know that work is currently underway in how to implement the recommendations of the Reserve Forces 2030 review and ensure that as a country we use our reserve forces ever more effectively. Rest assured, General, as the Lord Mayor, I will always encourage the skills you will find in the city to be put to use in our armed forces, and conversely, the skills you will find in armed forces to be put to use here in the city. We recognise the importance of defence, not just for our physical security, but also for defending the things which the City of London as a global financial business centre depends on, namely international trade, international law, and international stability. The freedom of the skies is important for the movement of people, something we are all even more aware of following the recent events in the air above Belarus. The freedom of the seas is important for the movement of goods, which of course we depend on as an island nation. But now, of course, we also have to consider the free and secure flow of data and communications across the globe. This is where the Army's new capabilities in cybersecurity are so important, alongside, of course, the city's own capabilities. The city itself has a responsibility to contribute to national security in its widest sense, which is why we and the City of London Police in particular have invested as much in cyber. The City of London Police are now the national lead force for cybercrime, thereby strengthening the city's focus in this field. This cyber capacity will also help to deal with non-state actors and serious organised crime as part of an overall cyber defence. This is important for the whole of financial and professional services, but particularly for the insurance sector, and it is a vital component of the resilience of the city. Together, and working with the National Cyber Force and the new cyber corridor across the north of England, we are making the UK more resilient against the threat of massive disruption. Over the last year and a half, and even right now, we must all appreciate the Army's contribution to UK resilience in supporting the response to COVID, in what the MOD has confirmed is the biggest ever homeland military operation in peacetime. The title of the lecture the General will soon give refers to the disrupted world we live in, which is indeed full of threats and disruptions, to what is often called the rules-based international system. This is not the most catchy phrase, so I prefer to say the liberal international order, or if we need to be more specific, the international rule of law. As the Prime Minister recognises in his foreword to the integrated review, maintaining an open and resilient international order is in turn the best guarantor of security for our own citizens. Our armed forces are vital to us maintaining that order and making sense of the disrupted world in which we live. As you may be aware, as Lord Mayor, I spend much of my time conducting international visits, whether they be in person or virtual, to support the UK's trade and investment relationships. Of course, the British Army still has a presence in many countries around the world, protecting our interests, defending our values, working with partners and supporting our friends. People often call it boots on the ground, but you are so much more than that. You are often the face of the UK in many countries, training local forces, supporting our allies, and contributing to international security, all in a way which really does show the best of British. I once read with interest that one of the things that most concerned Soviet planners during the Cold War was not necessarily the UK's missiles, but the quality of the British Army. Indeed, one retired officer from the Russian General Staff observed, "Britain has always had the best light infantry in the world, and the rascals get places faster than we would like." He didn't actually say rascals, but I'm sure your imagination will provide a colourful alternative. This suggests that I was on the right track when I was younger and was considering a short service commission in the Royal Green Jackets. We understandably draw distinctions between hard and soft power. But the two go hand in hand, and one cannot succeed without the other. It is the UK's combination of the two that is so valuable and which will be important as we face new international threats and global disruptions. The City of London is one of the UK's great strengths, for which we are recognised around the world, and so are our armed forces. I hope we can continue to support each other and to share our skills, expertise and capabilities to secure, in the words of the integrated review, a global Britain in a competitive age. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce the Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Mark CARLETON-SMITH.
Well, Lord Mayor, good afternoon, and indeed Lady Mayoress. Lovely to see you both. Sheriffs, aldermen, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted on behalf of William, and frankly not a little relieved, finally to be able to honour the Lord Mayor's invitation to deliver his defence and security speech, an opportunity that he first proposed really nearly 2 years ago during that halcyon and seemingly historic period BC. Well, here we are, nearly a couple of years later, some of us more physically apparent than others in the hybrid spirit of these times, but William is still the Lord Mayor. And those of you familiar with some of his sporting habits will recognise this pattern and the emphasis on being not out. And of course, in securing his follow-on innings, William enters the record books alongside, amongst others, Dick Whittington, as one, I believe, of only 4 Lord Mayors to have served a double term or more. But he's not the first Lord Mayor to have summoned the Army Chief to the Mansion House. That distinction, I think, belongs to one Brackley Kennet. We need to go back some 241 years to the summer of 1780. The 6th of June, to be precise. The city that night was on fire. The Gordon riots were at their most violent. Businesses and homes were being ransacked, and the gates of Newgate Prison had been breached, spilling their residents out onto the streets of the city. And confronted by this increasing anarchy on his doorstep, Kennet appealed to the Crown for some horse and foot to quell the riot, to protect his Mansion House and the Bank of England. And a detachment of the Brigade of Guards marched that night up from Buckingham Palace, restored order, and secured the Bank of England, the institution that would go on to provide the essential monetary stability to support a growing industrial nation, and, amongst other things, gave rise to what was known as the Bank Picket, a platoon of guardsmen who protected the Bank of England every night, marching up through the city before the gas lamps were lit. And somewhat amazingly, this seemingly essential element of national fiscal security continued without interruption until the 31st of March, 1973, when it was finally and completely suspended. The only change in over 240 years being that towards the end of the detachment, they were occasionally wont to jump on the tube if it was raining. Now, the Lord Mayor may wish to note that Kennet's own reputation was rather shorter-lived. He was judged to have been complacent, convicted of criminal negligence, and he was fined the then enormous sum of £1,000. So today, we may not need the Brigade of Guards to protect the nation's gold reserves, but the relationship between defence, the country's economic health and security, and a city that sits at the heart of a globally interconnected financial system remains just as important as it ever was, and perhaps in an age characterized by strategic volatility, even more so. Because the experience of the COVID pandemic has exacerbated some underlying global morbidity, and it's exposed some wider destabilizing asymmetries. Not least, I think, we've all been reminded that low probability but high impact events can and do occur. And we've come to appreciate what a strategic shock feels like. Because whilst a pandemic was always high on the government's risk register, it was a flu pandemic that we were prepared for, not a SARS-2 coronavirus. So as Mark Twain presciently said, prediction is easy so long as you steer clear of the future. And in the absence of accurate weather forecasting, pricing in the resilience to be able to absorb a shock, adapt, and still emerge more competitive than the opposition may be the entry cost for the survival of many of our businesses. And unsurprisingly, the events of the last 18 months have prompted a reappraisal of many of our priorities, since shocks tend to focus the mind. And in my world, it's reminded us of the importance of thinking much more strategically and expansively about the nature of defense and its relationship in a fast-changing world with the country's security. Because amongst other significant changes, we're witnessing the rollback and truncation of some of the more collaborative elements of globalization, vaccine diplomacy, for instance. Just at that moment, when in the face of a global pandemic, we all need an international consensus more than ever. The reimposition of border controls, sovereign territorial integrity, a thing again, the notion of self-sufficiency. It's called strategic autonomy in Paris today, and until recently, America first. And the further east you go, made in China 25. And just as our daily lives, tactical time has slowed down, strategic time seems to have accelerated. We've all been through a digital boot camp, and whilst our personal geography may have shrunk, our virtual networks have expanded exponentially. Things that only 18 months ago seemed inconceivable are now accepted as the new abnormal. Maybe Lenin was right. There really are weeks when decades happen. And perhaps we're deeper into the third decade of the 21st century than we yet realize, with the Pacific century arriving much faster than we appreciate. So that's why I emphasize this point about a prevailing condition of strategic volatility. Yes, it's exacerbated by COVID, but actually it's the product of several longer-term trends that have been accelerating at exponential pace, supercharged by the democratizing effect of a permanent and escalating technological revolution, which, in inevitable historical coincidence, aligns with the re-emergence of great power competition between states and balance of power considerations, once more the currency of strategic exchange. And it's defined by the application of state power in pursuit of competing grand strategic visions. One planet, two systems. Power, its authority, influence, and projection being both a means and an end in a competitive international system. And it's an uncomfortable reminder that the rules-based system that has regulated international discourse for all of my life isn't self-sustaining, and indeed nor is it self-organizing. It's actually underpinned by power. It's underpinned by raw, hard power, predominantly, albeit not exclusively, American hard power. And it's not too early to see the rough outline of a new geopolitical age emerging, conceivably the rebalancing of one transatlantic era with a growing emphasis on the Asia-Pacific in response to an increasingly bifurcated world hinged around China. America's strategic vision shifting to a new conception of its interests in Europe and the Middle East in proportionate response to the systemic competition unfolding across the Pacific. And these tectonic generational shifts are compounded by a proliferation of threats to our security that are much more hybrid and much more difficult to protect against. It's not only missiles and tanks, much as Russia today reminds us how dangerous they can be. It's also the consequences of this era of truth decay, subversion, disinformation, techno-authoritarianism. The internet, not just a means of communication, but a tool for coercion and cyber contagion. Big tech, very quickly, can become Big Brother, ransomware, and dark side. We're also living through a second wave of imperialism, but in a 21st century context, with data now at the center of global trade, this is a second wave of data imperialism, where most of the big players aren't governments or even countries. They're private companies in an era when shaping the rules around digital power is a key component in geopolitical competition. A digital Silk Road to complement its economic Belt and Road, China has a strategic vision for the digital age. China Standard. It even has a date, 2035. And it's hard to overstate the importance of this technological arms race, because it's difficult to imagine that some digital World Health Organization is going to ride to our rescue, setting rules around cyber hygiene and arms control. This is still a digital Wild West, in which it would be a mistake to fall into the trap of technological dependency. So the picture is one of growing systemic competition. In some respects, the deliberate weaponization of those elements of globalization that hitherto we assumed would keep us both safe and prosperous. The free movement of people, of goods, data, and ideas. And in the light of our COVID experience, we might also want to reflect on the importance to our security of the integrity of our 5G networks and wider digital infrastructure, on our assured access and control of pharmaceuticals, the reshoring of some of our more sensitive supply chains and strategic stockpiles, the impact of artificial intelligence and quantum computing, and of course, the very real significance of clean and reliable energy to our future. And in many respects, these are just as important to our national security, alongside the financial health of the nation, as our more traditional, conventional military advantages. The notion of strategic resilience and the integrity of our strategic base and critical national infrastructure is on the table again, in an uncertain and unpredictable world, one in which Pax Americana finds itself being stretched by no less than 3 authoritarian states, Russia, Iran, and China, each of which is seeking its own independent sphere of influence, separate to any American-backed global order or rulebook. And so, to my mind, we sit today at the juncture of 3 potential confrontations. The first and closest to home is the incremental erosion of the European security settlement that has broadly pertained since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. It's being challenged most directly by Russia, and Russia today is not a status quo power. Stung by then-President Obama's dismissal as not much more than a regional power, Russia craves an equivalence at the top table, alongside the United States, but its roguish behavior and its reputation as the most prolific stoker of instability on Europe's borders, meddling in Western liberal democracies, only undermines its legitimacy. Russia seems bent on a systematic campaign of division across Europe and its alliances, whilst it develops a potent mix of hybrid capabilities to threaten our democracies. It's in revisionist mode, and whilst we may read Russia less well today than the Kremlinologists of the past, their lack of respect for weakness, especially military weakness, hasn't changed one bit. Strategic cooperation with Russia has been in decline for too long. Trust is in very short supply, and relations feel at best brittle. But establishing a European consensus as to how to manage Russia is proving elusive, an opportunity that Moscow is quick to exploit. And whilst Russia may appear to some as a power in decline, Russia still matters a lot, especially in Europe. It comes with a lethal inventory, a growing and unpredictable risk appetite, and undiminished ambition. And that's a cause for concern. More than anything now, we need a more principled and structured relationship with a more responsible and constructive Russia. The lack of it leads to a relationship that is immediately confrontational, which is in no one's interest. The second hotspot is the Middle East, which continues to spawn a range of coterminous crises exacerbated by the grinding tectonic plates of generational change across the region. The Syrian civil war, the Yemeni humanitarian disaster, residual al-Qaeda and Daesh presence, and the existential legacy of our own Western interventions over the last 30 years, which together have redefined the strategic geometry of the region. Today, the net beneficiary seems to be Iran, busy exploiting political vacuums and re-establishing the sheer crescent from the Mediterranean to Tehran, transforming its geostrategic position, mobilizing its proxies, and extending its malign influence through the region, and seemingly no longer deterred by conventional American capability. My third and final touchstone is, of course, China. Possibly within a decade, the world's largest economy, and conceivably by the middle of the century, with an economy larger than the United States and the European Union combined. So China, destined to become the world's economic powerhouse, matched by the world's largest armed forces, controlled not by a democracy, but by the Chinese Communist Party. A Communist Party who don't share our worldview or our values, and who regard the international rules-based system as not much more than code for Western hegemony. And the very real prospect, despite its lack of democratic legitimacy, that the Chinese Communist Party will usher in an era of economic growth such that each successive Chinese generation gets progressively richer. We will have to hope that that is equally true here in the West. So we have to get China right, because great power competition doesn't necessarily lead to great power conflict, or indeed the Thucydides trap. But there is a danger of strategic miscalculation, not helped by China's propaganda, by its assertive agenda and hardline strategy of wolf diplomacy and economic coercion. China seems to believe that their inexorable rise is matched by the terminal and irreversible structural decline of the West, with the associated changes in the international landscape falling in their favor as they place ever greater emphasis on digital domination, artificial intelligence, and a growing economic self-sufficiency, relying on domestic consumption as a long-term driver of economic growth and the gravitational pull of the world's largest single consumer market. But that, of course, is to overlook the considerable internal tensions, paradoxes, and contradictions that China faces. A country that had to spend around $216 billion on their own domestic public security in 2019 alone. So managing these internal inequalities may prove to be the party's single greatest challenge, giving the lie to any assumed historical inevitability about China's invincibility. So in dealing with China, which we must, there are probably some sensible principles. Firstly, size matters, and allies and partners will become even more important to the maintenance of an overall balance of power, because even the strategic inventory of the United States on its own lacks the requisite heft. So it makes sense to approach it on a regional basis rather than having all our eggs in a China basket. Hence our emphasis on a broader Indo-Asia-Pacific strategy that links India, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the inaugural patrol of our latest and largest ever aircraft carrier is to the Far East. If China is going to be a systemic competitor, it's in all our interests to keep it that way, a competition rather than a conflict. And our strategic dialogue needs to have sufficient tolerance to allow a widening from a start point of negotiable economics to one of more substantial first principles across a range of load-bearing issues. Think climate change, biodiversity, and trade most obviously, where we share a common interest, but also accommodating more difficult and contentious issues where our values are at odds over human rights and international rules and standards. Candor, honesty, and transparency should characterize our relationship. A strategy of competitive and cooperative reciprocity. So these aren't the easiest of times for reasonable and rational nations that set store by playing by the rules in an increasingly hostile world that seems inimical to liberal democracy. It's certainly not a benign horizon as policymakers grapple with the changing nature of systemic competition, the redistribution of global power, and the rapidly evolving technological landscape, which is exposing a growing gap as industrial age organizations are confronted by information age problems. And the pace of change outstrips our institutional ability to reapportion resources, to upskill our workforce, and contemporize our corporate culture, whilst at the same time it renders legacy structures and systems obsolete ever more rapidly. The list of things to do looks alarming. Manage the rise of an assertive China, check Putin's Russia, halt Iranian malign influence and nuclear ambition, suppress radical Islamist terrorism, and counter the growing threat of bioterrorism and cyber extortion, manage a global pandemic, and tackle global warming. That's a big inbox and speaks to the need for a re-energized approach to diplomacy, defense, security, and development. And the government is matching its refreshed ambition with an extra £24 billion for defense, a really significant strategic investment underpinning an outward-looking vision for a modern global Britain. And we must spend it wisely, since it's a commonplace that we have a world-leading diplomatic service and unrivaled intelligence agencies, armed forces, and an exceptional inventory of soft power. But still, the prevailing consensus is that we could do better by way of coordination and integration. And in the context of a more competitive world, indeed, we must do better. Maximizing the opportunities of our newfound independence and the latitude that comes with leaving the EU, reinforcing existing alliances whilst forging new partnerships and embracing a more proactive international agenda and posture, really getting after those metrics that are going to count in tomorrow's world: our national prosperity, our security, and our international influence. Which is why the emphasis today in the armed forces is to underwrite that strategic concept of global Britain, which boils down to a dynamic international footprint supporting a global network of partners and allies, a modernized force structure with a richer blend of regular and reserves fit for the digital age and adapted to the changing character of warfare, supported by the capabilities, the culture, and the skills for what actually lies ahead of us rather than is already behind us, recognizing that the fundamental purpose of our armed forces is to prevent wars in the first place, but to be prepared for warfare at its very most feral if it should come to it. Not the last war we fought, or the war we'd like to fight or anticipate having to fight, but actually the war we may have no choice but to fight. Put simply, warfare is a reciprocal relationship, and it happens when the people who start them think they're going to win, and sometimes they choose you. And we rather naturally assume that we're the 20th century post-war generation. But what would it be like if we were wrong, and that in fact we were actually the 21st century pre-war generation? And how would that feel? Well, my job, ladies and gentlemen, is to make sure that we never get to find out. Thank you very much.
Sheriffs, Aldermen, Sirs, ladies and gentlemen, we now have approximately 20 to 25 minutes for questions, which we can take both from the room and also from those who are joining us online. So for those in the room, could I ask you, if you have a question, pop your hand up, please, and then step forward. There are 2 microphones on the left-hand, right-hand side. If you could state your name and your organisation and then ask your question, please. And for those joining us remotely, we have some technology here, so I would encourage you to type away with your questions. And once we've started with questions from the hall, then we'll deal with some of the online ones. So could I invite our first questioner from the Egyptian parlour, please? Okay, I think we have one here. If you'd like just to step forward to the microphone, please.
Durham alumni, I know.
Thank you. I thought it might come, Lord Mayor. Lord Mayor, thank you for hosting this. CGS, fascinating. Thank you very much. My question is perhaps to add to your inbox. The one thing you didn't cover in terms of the problems ahead is population. A declining Chinese population, supporting ever more economic and global influence activity, a sub-Saharan African population that is going to explode, and the inevitable population migration challenges. A short question, how do you think that alters your inbox?
Well, it may be the single prevailing leitmotif that links all the previous list of jobs to do, because I think, Malachy, you are right to highlight that if the demographic indices are in any sense accurate, we must predict that the population of sub-Saharan Africa more than doubles over the next 25 years, something close to 2.4 billion. And over the last 7 or 8 years, we've got direct experience as to what happens. And it may be that Europe has simply absorbed the very tip of that human volcano. And sitting beneath the waterline is that human bow wave. And that emerges at just the same juncture as the North African littoral, which acts as the cockpit for the principal migration routes, come under increasing Russian influence. Think Libya specifically today. And it's not inconceivable to imagine that opposition entities can turn the immigration switch on and off to their own convenience, targeting Italy and Spain, the Western Balkans, at their own convenience. And of course, we recognize only too clearly the polarizing political effects of what that might mean for us. And there are, of course, 2 or 3 ways to tackle this. One is to try and manage it at source, but I don't necessarily detect the sort of strategic international ambition to do that. The other is to shut up shop closer to home. And of course, that comes with very specific, political risk.
Okay, I think we had a hand at the far side of the room as well. Thank you.
General, my name's Simon McMenemy. I'm a lawyer in the city with oversight of offices in Paris and Berlin. I'm also a serving reservist, former commanding officer of the Royal Yeomanry. General, my question pertains really to Russia, and with before COVID, frequent trips to France and Germany. Those of us who've been in the military, been on operations with our American friends, we have a very close bond with them. Despite alliances, for example, the current one we have with France, isn't it now time for Germany, as the dominant economy in Europe, to sort of step up to the plate and face up to Russia? Because it seems to be, with gas pipelines and all the rest of it, as if the opposite is happening.
Well, I might widen your observation. I mean, whether we need narrow that down specifically to Germany. I mean, I highlighted how difficult it is to establish a pan-European consensus as to the relative challenge and threat that Russia poses. And of course, much of it is dependent on one's historical precedents, experience, and the geography. And so the Eastern European countries will take a much more hardline view than some Western European nations. I think, though, the common denominator is that the principal European security players in the NATO alliance need to recognize that we need to take up a greater share of the cost of our own security. It's a difficult figure to try and get at, but I believe today that the American taxpayer might be responsible for between 35 to 40% of the complete security spend for European security. That doesn't feel like an equitable distribution. And if you then consider that this is a United States who are going to find themselves increasingly drawn to the Pacific, America today, not just a transatlantic nation, it's always been a Pacific nation. And Americans have been in Europe very much more recently than they've been across the Asia-Pacific. I think the signals are very clear that Europe needs to take much more account, including the investment it's prepared to make in its own security.
So, General, I think we have a couple of questions now which have come online. The first one is anonymous, I'm afraid, but the question is, across the 5 operational domains, what do you think the most important military capabilities are?
Right now, the most important requirement is the ability to synthesize and integrate all the specific environmental capabilities, land, sea, air, space, and cyber, into one single coherent enterprise. And that's going to require a digital synchromesh, occasionally referred to as a digital backbone, that doesn't exist today, but is going to be fundamental to our success in the future, that to all intents and purposes links satellites to soldiers, boots to bots, and proxies to pixels. And technologically, it's feasible, but it's a very significant digital transformation that we're going to be on for the balance of this decade.
Okay, the next question that we have online comes from, and apologies if I don't pronounce this properly, but Hugh Olivia Bellisis. I feel that this is a city question coming from a livery company. So how can the livery companies assist you with the reserve forces? We have 2 affiliated reserve units. It seems that the soldiers are not always able to persuade their employers to release them for reserve soldiering. How do we persuade these companies to be more enthusiastic about the Army Reserve?
Well, thank you for that question, because I do believe that the livery companies have a vital and increasingly important function in acting as advocates for defense. I mean, we do live with a generation whereby it seems on occasion a growing gap between the reality of the armed forces, their purpose and their existence, and the wider public. And if there is any legacy from our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, it tends to be questioning as to the relative wisdom and advantage of them in the first place. But the livery companies act, I think, as a vital partnership, not just in persuading employers of the benefit that servicemen and women can bring to their own businesses, but also the additional net advantages of employing people who have an instinct for public service, the golden thread for the armed forces being reliant on our people and their inclination to volunteer and to serve. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the livery companies for the support that they give the armed forces across the entire waterfront today.
And a follow-on question on a similar vein, looking towards RF30, how critical is RF30 to your vision for the future of the British Army?
It's the contribution that the reserve has always been important, but never entirely followed through, I think, with genuine commitment by the system. And today, with the reduction in size of the regular component, we are going to mortgage very considerable elements of our outputs to a much more guaranteed and assured contribution by the reserves. And so we are going to be appealing to young men and women who are going to have to guarantee up to and including an unlimited liability in the event of a major existential war to support the regular component. And I also think in the light of the COVID experience, we recognize that those who are closest to their communities are those who live in them, and those are our reservists. And I see no real reason why almost the first line of national defense at home can't be led by the reserve community. I detect an appetite for that. We just need to be able to provide the right incentive structures. It may rely on primary legislation to underwrite it with respect to employers, but that's precisely, I think, the antidote that RF30 lays out for us.
We now have another question which has come from a livery company. So this is from Tim Smith. Tim is the clerk of the Salters. And General, a rather UK parochial question, but what are the defence plans as a result of an independent Scotland?
Well, we don't run up contingency plans for that wider degree of political contingency. I personally don't necessarily think that we're at that juncture whereby we need to be actively planning for the separation of the Union. Given the world condition that I've outlined this afternoon, I think all elements of the United Kingdom might consider that the partnership and the alliance that we enjoy has served us well for some 300 odd years and may yet well serve us importantly into the future.
My Lord Mayor.
I describe myself as the Green Lord Mayor, and climate change and greening finance and financing green is absolutely critical, and one of the biggest issues is climate change. Yeah. And how do you see the armed forces' role in, to be frank, the next disaster that's going to face the world? And, you know, you've highlighted potential disasters in your world, but how do you see the armed forces' role around climate change?
I mean, I do think that we have got a responsibility to lean in to the environmental and sustainability agenda to the extent that we can. What I'm not saying or promising is that warfare of the future is going to be net zero. It is anything but. But I am the custodian of just over 1% of the UK landmass. I'm the second largest landowner in the country. I employ just over 100,000 people in 3 or 4 super garrisons across the country. So it's not beyond the realms of our national responsibility to make sure that over the coming decades that we can't arrange ourselves so that we are administratively and sustainably as environmentally efficient as we can. And in that regard, we're opening our first 4 solar farms in July and August, and we've got plans on the books for at least another 70.
So we have one more online question, but if I could just invite the floor again. Any further questions from the hall? I think we have one towards the left-hand side there.
My Lord Mayor, Robert Hughes Penny, Alderman, Investment Director at Rathbones in the City and former soldier. General, can I thank you first of all for your words and your inspiring speech this afternoon, a lot to think about. And can I thank you as well and all those that you command and lead for the work that you do in protecting this nation. We are very grateful. My question is about China. We in the City have worked very hard over the last 20 or 30 years to develop strong commercial links with China. And we value those enormously, and they are a source of great revenue and great opportunity. We recognize as well, more recently, that the tectonic plates have been shifting, as you have alluded to, with regard to China. What words of wisdom would you give to the City leaders as they navigate that change, bearing in mind the significant commercial opportunities, and reflecting that London is one of the world's leading renminbi trading centres? Thank you.
Well, I think your industry is going to find itself as one of those most important load-bearing institutions, because we need to have a strategic relationship with China, and one of the most important is the economic relationship. And of course, all countries are going to have to manage a degree of schizophrenia with respect to their wider security considerations, but also their economic necessity and ambition. China, of course, recognizes that as their opportunity. But I think if we can embark on this enterprise in a spirit of transparency, but also the reciprocity that I spoke about, one ought to be able to engage in a constructive relationship, recognizing that one of the principles underpinning reciprocity is that if we find our own interests are being injured, then we'll be prepared to return that favor.
So before we go to the final question online, do we have any further ones from the floor? Okay, so the final one, sir, is, again, I'm afraid, anonymous. Legacy equipment and procurement issues appear to be a continuing theme. Are you able to put our minds at ease concerning the overall effectiveness of our military equipment procurement processes, and in particular, the Ajax vehicle project and its fitness for future operations?
Well, there's a lot wrapped up in that question. But the underlying premise is that our procurement isn't yet sufficiently agile for such a rapidly changing technological landscape, and I would agree with that premise. But given that that is widely recognized, we are now in the process of re-engineering the protocols and the boundaries, and indeed resetting the strategic relationship, not just with the core defense industrial primes, but actually some of these more important small and medium enterprises who today are incubating the rapidly evolving technology that's going to be absolutely fundamental to that digital synchromesh that I described earlier. With respect to the specifics around land ground maneuver programs, I'm much more confident in the conclusion of the integrated review that we do now have a defined financial envelope over the full 10-year period, which is not something that any previous review has guaranteed for the Army. So today we are able to go to the market with confidence in order to fix what is already an old and increasingly obsolete land vehicle fleet. The Ajax itself is suffering some early teething problems. It's the most sophisticated capability that the Army has fielded ever. It's got over 3 million lines of code in it. It's effectively a computer on tracks. So I don't think it's surprising that in fielding it, we're finding some early problems.
Thank you, General. Actually, there is, I think, one final question, which actually I think probably quite rightly is on people. This comes from a Vicky Sheriff, who is a reservist. General, from your perspective, how informed and supportive are the British public to the challenges of defence, and what needs to be done to increase their support and understanding?
I think there's a prevailing national misunderstanding around the purpose of defence. There might be a prevailing impression that somehow in the wake of Afghanistan and Iraq, that service is bad for you and that somehow service damages you. So there is a strategic gap between the reality of what we offer our young people and what I think the public imagine it delivers. And that's a strategic narrative that we can't be complacent about, and actually we need to double down on. The reality is, I don't think we tell our story compellingly enough or more frequently enough.
General, thank you. I think that now concludes all the questions. So if we could move to concluding remarks, please.
That's you.
General, thank you very much for an incredibly insightful lecture and answering those questions so well with huge amounts of knowledge. And I know that I speak for everybody in the room and for those who watched how interesting it's been. And it's good to hear that you're leading us from the front, and there's lots of things in your inbox. And I suspect there'll be a few more things that will come into your inbox over the next months and weeks as well. But thank you very much, and we really appreciate your time here. Thank you.